Hello and welcome to a live Kerfefe break on Deprogrammed with Keri Smith. I am your host, Keri. I'm glad you're here. I see some regulars here. Thanks for being patient with me. We're starting a little late. Yesterday was daylight savings time, and guilty admission, I wasn't aware. And I thought I was going to be early to church. I was very proud of myself. I was like, I'm going to get there half an hour early, walk down to the square, get a coffee, and then halfway there, I realized that my truck clock and my phone clock were different. So I was late. and yeah, that's how that went. I was on a day when I was feeling so good too. Like, look how early I am. So anyway, welcome. Thanks for being patient. If you are new here, this is oh no, Texas Sheep Lady, did you miss the service? No, I was just late. I did not miss it. Which by the way, I know who this is. Good to see you. If you are based near Georgetown, Texas, the update on my church, which some of you know, we were evicted from a second location and by the grace of God, found a new place to meet, a church that's willing to rent to us. And so we are meeting. This was our second service there. We're meeting at the Main Street Baptist Church in Georgetown, Texas, at 2:00 on Sundays. And you're always welcome to join us. Yesterday was a fantastic sermon. I can't wait until they put that one online. Yesterday was a sermon about discipline and the responsibility of parents in disciplining children and how it relates to the lack of discipline in society, how it relates to a lot of the problems that Generation Z are facing, incredibly high rates of depression, anxiety, um, other types of mental disorders, and over medication. So it was really an important lesson yesterday, and last week as well. But uh, just a couple of announcements. Today we're going to continue with the WPATH files. Somebody suggested I call them the Warpath files. Thought that was a good moniker for it. We're going to continue with the WPATH files because I think it's probably one of the most, if not the most important crisis facing our culture at the moment. We are actively destroying children. Our society is allowing this to happen. Our politicians, our laws, a medical establishment, parents are allowing this to happen. There's an epidemic of so-called trans kids that has been occurring for the past 5 to 10 years. And there's also a growing epidemic of detransitioners now, people who in young adulthood are deciding they made a mistake and are regretting the fact that their parents and the medical establishment and the laws of this country did not protect them from harm. So I think this is one of the most pressing problems, and the WPATH files just came out. The WPATH files, we covered it in part 1 on Friday. WPATH is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. This is the organization that has been guiding medical and legal policy surrounding so-called gender affirming care for children in the United States and in many other countries. Now, I'm going to start off at the top by telling you this because I hope there are people from the left watching. I really hope there are liberals watching who maybe you don't know much about this issue. You think you do. Maybe you think you've made up your mind. But if you're honest with yourself, you haven't really looked at the facts or source material. I hope you're watching. A couple things up front that you may not know. Some of the most progressive Scandinavian and European countries have now banned so-called gender affirming care for kids, for minors, saying you have to wait until you're 18. And those countries did so. We're talking about Norway, Finland, Sweden, the UK. They're some of the only countries that have done a systematic medical review by the medical community in those countries of the available evidence to determine if we should be doing this to children. And as a result of those reviews, the medical community said, no, children are not capable of giving informed consent. So it violates the Hippocratic Oath, and that there's no evidence that this is a legitimate and or ethical science. There's certainly no evidence. Their biggest claim is that you have to allow this to happen. Otherwise, so-called trans kids will kill themselves. There's no evidence to show that this affects suicide rates at all. So the medical communities of these progressive countries have said, no, we should not be doing this on children. I'm saying that up front because you may not know that. Please go and look it up. Look up the systematic reviews that have been done. What I have found is that I've known this for a while. I'll say this. When I was in the woke world, when I was in the social justice world, there are a lot of psychological roadblocks, blocks that are put up when you're in that kind of world. I call it a cult, that prevent you from reading original sources on your own and forming your opinion, that prevent you from watching original video footage and making up your own mind. And oftentimes when something like the WPATH files comes out, this has already happened. I was excited. Many people are excited thinking, this is it. This is going to be the crack in this barbaric practice. This is what's going to be the watershed moment. And, the journalist who released the files, who put the report together, Michael Shellenberger, he's not a right winger. This is a guy on the left. So we're thinking, I know it becomes, people want to think, oh, maybe those who are still in that echo chamber will listen to Michael Shellenberger, or maybe they'll listen to, whoever this person is on the left who's saying this. But what usually happens is, as soon as that person has spoken a single unorthodox opinion, or unorthodox woke, so it's not woke, an opinion that doesn't fit with the ideology, or a fact that contradicts the ideology, if they've spoken a fact, they are immediately put on the bad people list. Anything they do or say can be disregarded. And so I already had a friend, someone I knew in real life who's a friend, who wanted to talk about the WPATH files in response to the first video I made, but did not watch the video and admitted, did not read the WPATH files. So it's sort of like, well, how can we have a conversation then? Because you don't know what we're talking about. And I tried to gently encourage. My tone could have been a little less brusque, I'll admit. I tried to gently encourage reading the WPATH files, and the first response I got was, no, I'm not going to read that because that journalist is blah, blah, blah. It's genetic fallacy. Genetic fallacy is when you refuse to look at the contents of something, be it a book or a study or news report, a piece of music, or whatever it is, a piece of art. You refuse to actually examine it yourself because you say that the so-called source is contaminated. They're bad. They're on the bad list. It's a bad publication. It's a bad person. It's a bad whatever. So this, the first response I got from this friend was, well, I'm not going to read it because genetic fallacy, because Michael Shellenberger, whatever. And I don't trust said bad person, right? Here's what I say to those people. Maybe you can try this in your conversations, because this is true. It's not about trusting them. Nobody's asking you to trust the journalist who put this out. You should trust yourself as an adult who has the ability to reason. You should trust yourself and your ability to read a report and parse opinion from fact. There are actual screenshots of communication in the WPATH files between doctors. There are doctors on record and on video admitting, number one, that these children are not able to give informed consent, that they don't actually have the cognitive ability to comprehend what they're consenting to. We even watched a video on Friday in the first video in this series, the first WPATH files. We watched a video of doctors laughing about it, saying, you have to ask for informed consent, but a 9-year-old, they don't really understand what they're consenting to when they say, sure, I might be sterilized, sure, I might never have kids. These doctors know this, and they're on record saying this. And you're an adult, you should trust yourself to be able to look at primary sources that are in the report, look at the video, look at the communications between the doctors and the stuff they've said. They revealed this in writing, that these kids don't have the ability to give informed consent. And that's separate from any opinion that's offered in the report. So trust yourself enough. Trust your ability to read original sources, to listen to original sources, and to look at facts. Trust your ability to look at facts and be able to tell the difference between a fact and an opinion. The good news is my friend is open-minded enough that they did eventually read part of the report. And so we were able to have a bit more of a back and forth, a bit more. And that's great news. And I'm very grateful to my friend, because I know it can't be easy to be a dissenting voice on my feed, on my social media at this point. It used to be the opposite. A few years ago, if you weren't woke, it was like you couldn't, you wouldn't want to, you'd be in the minority. You'd be the lone voice. Now it's the opposite. I have a lot of critical thinkers on my feed, or people who are outside the woke world, people of all types, but who, I guess the most catch-all term would be reality-based, in my opinion, or, anti-woke, people who oppose woke ideology but have their own belief system. And so I'm very grateful for my friend that he was brave enough to voice an opinion, and also open-minded enough to trust himself enough to not take offense at that suggestion, which is not meant to cause offense. It's a matter of fact. It's like, how can I discuss a book with you if you haven't read the book? Like, how can we have a back and forth? How can I discuss a piece of music with you if you haven't listened to it? Like, how can we have a why would I listen to what you have to say about it when you haven't watched it, read it, listened to it, And that's just factual. It's not meant to be insulting. And I'm very grateful that he did not take it as an insult and he went and read part of it. So you can try this with people if you're trying to talk about the WPATH files with them. Probably to mixed results. But if the first thing they do is say, well, I'm not going to read that because genetic fallacy, just tell them you don't have to trust the people who put it out. You're an adult. Trust yourself. Trust your judgment. Trust your ability to tell the difference between facts and opinion, and then come to your own opinion. It may not change your mind. If you're very confident it's not going to change your mind, then what's the harm of being better informed to know what's in there, right? So that was just some thoughts I had about it. So we're covering the WPATH files because I think it is so important. Despite that initial resistance from one friend to read it, like I said, he did read some of it. And I still believe this has the ability to be the watershed moment where we turn this thing around in the US. It's already been turned around in some of the European countries, as I mentioned at the beginning. We have to do something about it here in the States. I don't care if it's the medical community self-regulating or if it's the government enforcing laws. This is something else, and I'm grateful to my friend for talking with me because he helped me clarify my thoughts on this. It doesn't matter to me. I would love it if the medical community self-governed here and did a systematic review like has happened in Europe and said, this is barbaric. We have to stop this. Kids can't consent to this. They don't know what they're consenting to. We're sterilizing them. Remember what we watched last week? In 100% of cases, the president of WPATH is on video at a Duke University forum admitting that in 100% of cases where they give puberty blockers to young boys who are in the Tanner 2 stage, that means around the years of like 10 years old, 11 years old, 100% of cases, those boys are chemically castrated. They're never able to achieve orgasm in adulthood. That's permanent. How are 9 and 10, 11-year-olds supposed to be able to comprehend that? They're not, and the doctors admit that they're not. That's also in the video. So, I still think this has the ability to be the thing that ends it here. I don't care if it's the medical community self-governing. I don't think that's gonna happen here. I think they're making too much money. They're making lifelong medical patients out of these children. We went through some of the complications in the last episode. Yarden, the poor young man who died because his colon was leaking through the gaping wound where his penis used to be, his so-called neo-vagina, and they didn't care. And they canceled his follow-up appointments and said they couldn't do anything for him. We saw in the WPATH files the doctors admitting that it's very likely that the testosterone is causing liver tumors and liver cancer in young girls. One doctor even admitted on the record in these files that one of his female patients had died from liver cancer, and it was most likely due to the hormones. They're discussing this while talking about a child, a young girl who's on testosterone that they prescribed her, who's now developed liver tumors. And they just kept right on talking about how they're gonna get her scheduled for top surgery next. Didn't even care. Again, if you haven't read through them, you may think, "Oh, well, maybe they didn't link it to the they did. They directly linked it to the testosterone they were giving her. The doctors did. They are aware. Maybe it's hard for you to think that to wrap your head around the fact that some people could be so evil. Maybe that's it. It's an inability because you're not evil, you don't understand evil people. There are sociopaths out there. There are psychopaths out there. We tend to think of them only in terms of true crime, like serial killers, murderers. Most psychopaths are not that kind of murderer. There are evil people out there who can know these things, be doing these things to children, and not care about it. That is true. So, because I think it's very important to read through the WPATH files, maybe you're a person who doesn't watch, you just listen and you don't wanna you're busy, you're driving kids to school, to work, you don't have time to sit down and read it yourself. We're gonna be reading through it. We'll summarize some parts, but we're gonna read through a lot of it I'm doing a stream every day this week so we can get through WPATH files without waiting, Mondays and Fridays. We're doing it every day. So we'll be back at this time tomorrow at 1:00 Central to pick up where we left off today. I also wanna announce we have this Wednesday night, before I forget, this Wednesday night, we have another live That Christian panel at 6:00 Central, and it's gonna be myself, Brahmable, Odin from OMB Reviews, Michelle from Force of Light, and special guest Drunk 3PO. We're gonna be talking about the movie that's in theaters now, Ordinary Angels. We're gonna be reviewing it. If you would like to watch it before we discuss it on Wednesday night, you have to go see it in the theater, like the old-fashioned way. Yes, so that's Wednesday. That's my only announcement. Let's get into the topic. Okay, so I'm gonna pull up the WPATH files again. We're gonna jump into the beginning, and you might have noticed from the thumbnail today, I'm gonna be focusing on Dr. John Money. Now, I put up a poll to see how many of you are already familiar with him. let me just see what you guys said. Dr. John Money is known by as the father of trans and kids. He's the father of what we call the Orwellian phrase gender affirming care, aka mutilating and sterilizing children. Um, wow. Okay. So about half and half. 52% are already familiar with Dr. John Money and his abuse of David Reimer. 48% are not, though. Okay. So that's what we're covering today. He is mentioned in the WPATH files, of course, because his research abuse of children was so important to this field. When you talk about the history of so-called gender affirming care, you need to know about this monster, Dr. Money. Okay, so I'm skipping over the introduction here, which again, I encourage you to read the whole thing. This thing is 250 pages. We're going to cover the parts I think are most important. And we're going to jump into the very beginning. I love the fact that they lay out a foundation of so-called transgender medicine. And so we're going to start with this section, the brief history of transgender medicine in the early days of WPATH. Now, when we get to Dr. John Money, I'm going to pull up some other sources. The experiment to modify the sex characteristics of people suffering from the psychiatric disorder called gender dysphoria began in the early years of the 20th century with the pioneering work of German sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld. A gay man who engaged in cross-dressing, Hirschfeld coined the term transvestite in his 1910 book. I'm like, I do German. The Transvestite. I need my husband in here for the German. Die Transviten. Or German, everything sounds, Die Transviten. Okay. And he regarded both homosexuals and transvestites to be, quote, sexual intermediaries, end quote. Hirschfeld oversaw the world's first attempt at sex reassignment surgery performed on Martha/Carl Baer in 1906. While little is known about the precise nature of the surgery because the records were lost during the 1933 Nazi book burning of Hirschfeld's research, it is believed to have been a metoidioplasty, which is the creation of a pseudophallus out of an enlarged clitoris. Baer is thought to have had a disorder of sexual development and was reportedly genetically male. In 1919, Hirschfeld opened the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin, which was a first of its kind clinic providing counseling and treatment for, quote, physical and psychological sexual disorders, end quote, as well as, in particular, for, quote, sexual transitions. Notably, Einar Wegener or Lily Elbe, whose story was popularized in the film The Danish Girl, underwent surgical castration in Berlin under Hirschfeld's supervision in 1930. This was the first in a series of surgeries culminating in a womb transplant in 1931. Elbe died of heart failure 3 months after the final surgery, most likely due to organ rejection. The same year, Dora Richter underwent vaginoplasty, also under the care of Hirschfeld. Erwin Gorbrandt performed Richter's surgery, which is considered the world's first successful male-to-female sex reassignment. Gorbrandt then went on to join the Luftwaffe and participated in the hypothermia experiments conducted at the Dachau concentration camp. Despite medical advances such as the development of antibiotics and the ability to create synthetic hormones, interest in sex reassignment procedures waned over the next couple of decades, only to be rejuvenated in the 1950s with the sensational case of Christine Jorgensen. On December 1st, 1952, the New York Daily News ran a front page story under the headline, XGI becomes blonde beauty. Jorgensen had traveled to Denmark the year before and under the care of Dr. Christian Hamburger underwent a series of surgeries involving castration and the creation of a semblance of external female genitalia. In 1953, after returning home to the U.S., Jorgensen became a patient of Dr. Harry Benjamin, a German endocrinologist with an interest in transsexualism, as it was known at the time. Benjamin's career in medicine had a disreputable beginning when, in 1913, he arrived in New York as the assistant of a quack peddling, quote, turtle treatment, a fake tuberculosis vaccine. Benjamin had no formal training in sexology, but as a lifelong friend of Hirschfeld, he had a fascination for the subject. And by the 1950s, his practice was almost exclusively focused on transsexualism. While Jorgensen brought fame and attention to Benjamin's obscure interest in transsexualism, it was another patient who brought the other essential element, money. Reed, parentheses Rita Erickson, a female who transitioned to live as a man, became Benjamin's patient in 1963. Heir to a fortune, Erickson's philanthropic organization, Erickson Educational Foundation, EEF, funded the first 3 international symposiums on gender identity, as well as the newly formed Harry Benjamin Foundation. This enhanced Benjamin's professional status, lending credibility to his sex change experiment. Benjamin coined and popularized the term transsexual with his 1966 book, The Transsexual Phenomenon. Another of Erickson's philanthropic endeavors was to fund North America's first gender clinic at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. This is where our monster enters the story. It was at this clinic that Dr. John Money conducted his unethical experiments on children born with disorders of sexual development, the most famous case being that of the Reimer twins. As a baby, David Reimer was the victim of a catastrophic medical accident when the cauterizing equipment malfunctioned during his circumcision, amputating his penis. Money convinced David's parents to raise him as a girl, an experiment that failed. This is so interesting. Well, let me finish this sentence though, because this is the tragedy of David Reimer. Money convinced David's parents to raise him as a girl, an experiment that failed and ultimately resulted in David committing suicide at age 38. His twin brother Brian had died 2 years previously of an overdose. There's more about money contained here in the WPATH files, but I'm going to pause here for just a second. The queer theory being a part of social justice ideology, of the woke ideology that I used to be a part of. Queer theory is just one part of it. Again, social justice or woke, the best way I've come to describe it is as a belief system that says the best way to interpret the world is to look at it as a struggle for power among identity groups, and that every kind of identity can be divided into oppressor and oppressed groups, or privileged and marginalized groups. And that we have to redistribute power among these identity groups in order to reach equality or equity, right? This is what they use those words interchangeably, although they mean different things, equality and equity. This is social justice and woke. And so under this social justice woke umbrella, this belief system I was in for 20 years, there's all these categories of identity. And it's very cult-like. You get pulled in, a lot of people get pulled in through one of these categories of identity to begin with. I got pulled in through the feminist door. There's also a CRT door, a race door. There's a fat door for the fat studies and, fat acceptance movement. And there is a queer door, or a gay and lesbian door, or a trans door. So the queer theory part of social justice, this subject of identity, they maintain that gender is a social construct. The feminists do as well. And that we learn to perform gender, and that gender is fluid, and that you can change your gender. Now, originally, when they started pushing this, they said you need to divide gender from biological sex, that there's biological sex, which is a fact, and we're never going to attack that, right? And there's gender, and that's how you perform your gendered roles in society, right? And that's fluid and that can change. And you might be born a male, which is fixed, your biology's fixed, but your gender identity might be as a female, and you might choose to live as a female and present as a female. So this is what they're originally pushing. And they said, you know, now we know they're also attacking the category of biological sex. They separated those two things so they could get to this point of now. Once they get you to accept that there's this magical thing called gender and that that's fluid and can change, it's much easier now to get us to accept that biological sex isn't even real because your gender identity is what matters, right? That's what they say. How you identify is what matters. They even changed the language to manipulate you. They've changed it to a sex assigned at birth. Assigned, as if it's assigned. It's observed at birth. They use assigned at birth. It's like a psychopath or a sociopath who's trying to manipulate you. They use manipulative language. They use assigned at birth to imply that it's not fixed. It is fixed. Everyone is born either male or female. Even the people that get lumped into some category that they call intersex, people with different disorders, all of those people, regardless of how they present, are either male or female. People produce one kind of gamete. Nobody produces both. So they are now attacking biological sex as well and saying it's not real, that it's a social construct as well. I mean, that's what's happening. But so they've pushed this idea that gender is a social construct, that if you were raised differently, then you would present differently, and that our society has us locked into this restrictive gender prison where boys are like this and girls are like this. And so that's why, people need to be free to break free. And if that were the case, if they really believed that, then why are they now saying, and we have to be able to mutilate kids so that their biological sex matches however they present? Doesn't make any sense, right? Well, this doesn't make any sense either. Money was trying to prove through his experiments at Johns Hopkins on David. He was trying to prove that if you raised David as a girl and never told him he was a boy, that David, because gender is a social construct, he would believe he was a girl. That he would just socially construct the gender of female. And so he was trying to prove this. One of the things he did as a part of this is trigger warning or what have you, not to use the woke language, but I'm just content warning. If you have kids in the room, this is probably not appropriate for them. He forced David and his twin brother to simulate sex with one another. He sexually abused these brothers. He forced them to perform sexual acts on one another. He took photos of them doing this. He called it this as part of his research, this pervert. It turns out it didn't work. David did not believe he was a girl. He and his brother suffered great psychological damage. His brother Brian died at 36 of an overdose, and he committed suicide at 38. That's the story of John Money in a nutshell. We're going to get a little bit more detailed on it in a few minutes. The crazy thing is they will still cite this guy. People on the left, they will cite him. Like he's some important scientist or doctor or researcher. They refer to this guy, And a lot of people who are casually in the woke movement who say, they think they know the issues. They think they know that they agree with trans and kids, but they've never looked into the data. They're probably not going to read the WPATH files. They don't know what's actually happening to children, but they think they support it. They don't know about the history of this. They don't know that this guy that's often called the father of gender affirming care, or the father of transitioning children. They don't know that as part of his research, he was sexually abusing these brothers. They don't know anything about this. And what an atrocity to commit on 2 children. Talk about medical experimentation, which is what this is. I'm going to continue here with this paragraph in the WPATH files. But Money didn't just experiment on children. During the same period, he attempted to perform sex changes on adults, claiming great success. But when Dr. Paul McHugh became psychiatrist in chief at Johns Hopkins in 1975, he commissioned a follow-up study of the adults who had undergone these procedures, which found that while most of the patients claimed to be satisfied and experiencing no regret, there was little change in their psychological functioning. McHugh concluded that Johns Hopkins was therefore wasting scientific and technical resources by cooperating with a mental illness rather than trying to study, cure, and prevent it. The clinic was shut down in 1979. Even Erickson's own story has no happily ever after, lending weight to McHugh's conclusions. After commencing hormonal and surgical sex change interventions under the care of Benjamin, Erickson developed a drug addiction and endured a lifelong battle with substance abuse. What followed was 4 failed marriages and a life of turmoil. Erickson's EEF folded in 1977, and the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association was formed in 1978, which would later become WPATH. That's where it came from. The Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, which later became WPATH, published its first Standards of Care, or SOC, in 1979, followed closely by SOC 2 in 1980, SOC 3 in 1981, and SOC 4 in 1990. Now, remember what we just learned up here? This Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, which became WPATH, remember reading up here about how Benjamin had no formal training in sexology. He was just a lifelong friend of Hirschfeld, who was fascinated with transsexualism, with transvestites, and he himself was fascinated with it. That's how WPATH began. This guy who had a fascination for the subject. And he started off in New York, his history in medicine, literally as a snake oil salesman peddling a fake tuberculosis vaccine. That's how he started in medicine. Okay, I had to highlight that and underline that. That's where WPATH came from, is this guy. Okay, the Harry Benjamin Institute, as I mentioned, they published their first Standards of Care. In its early days, members at least attempted to pursue science and an understanding of this complex psychiatric disorder and the various psychological, hormonal, and surgical interventions available as a form of treatment. But around the late 1990s, the group took a turn. Dr. Stephen B. Levine was the chair of the SOC 5 committee in 1998 and recommended that the guidelines require patients to obtain 2 letters from mental health professionals before commencing hormones. Dr. Richard Green, the president at the time, was unhappy with this requirement. This is in 98. And so immediately commissioned a new Standards of Care 6, which was published just 3 years later and was almost identical, but advised only 1 letter from a mental health professional. This is why if you watch some based trans people who talk about their surgeries, people like my friend Suhaila, who I've interviewed on this channel, Suhaila Devi, or people like Buck Angel, like they used to have to go through a whole psychological evaluation. First of all, doing their due diligence, the doctors would try to figure out what underlying conditions they had. Could this be something else? Could this be dissociative identity disorder? Could they have a personality disorder? Could there be something else going on other than gender dysphoria, or that is a symptom of which is gender dysphoria? Was there sexual abuse in their past? Where they would go through. Now they don't do any of that, but they used to go through that and try to work out what it could be. And can we fix this? Can we fix you feeling uncomfortable in your body? without cutting your breasts off and sterilizing you, without cutting your penis off and sterilizing you? Could we fix it another way? They used to do that. They used to require you to live as to try and pass or present as the opposite sex for at least a year. They had a whole list of requirements. You had to get these 2 letters they mentioned from a 2 different mental health professionals. Okay, so they've gotten rid of all of this. As I mentioned in the last video, you can watch videos of I just watched a video of a 14-year-old going to a clinic, a gender reassignment clinic with a doctor they've never met and say they think they're trans and walk out with testosterone 9 minutes later. A prescription for testosterone. It's crazy. It's a minor, it's a child. I'm gonna continue. Okay, so they changed this to say only 1 letter needed. In the intervening years, activists began to overtake the organization, and in 2002, Dr. Levine resigned his membership due to his, quote, regretful conclusion that the organization and its recommendations had become dominated by politics and ideology. Wow. Rather than by scientific process, as it was years earlier. Yes. In 2007, the organization changed its name to WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. This change was significant. At the stroke of a brush, a loose affiliation of people had appointed themselves as the leading international authority on gender medicine. With the publication of its Standards of Care number 7 in 2012, the ideological shift identified by Levine was evident. Standards of Care number 7 recommended puberty blockers as a fully reversible pause button. How many times have you heard people repeating that? People who have never looked at source material, never looked at studies, never watched videos, but they get the propaganda filtered down through their echo chamber, and they run around saying, puberty blockers are fully reversible. Puberty blockers are fully reversible. Puberty blockers are like a pause button. It's like pausing a button. It's reversible. You can revert. It's not true. We watched on video the president of WPATH admitting that 100% of the little boys they put on puberty blockers are chemically castrated for life, cannot achieve orgasm. That's little boys at Tanner stage 2, which is around the ages of 9 to 11. 100%. That's a permanent effect. That's not reversible. That's not a pause button. That's the president of WPATH admitting that on camera. If you're an adult who runs around repeating things like that and you have not looked into the facts, I implore you, you should have enough respect for yourself as an adult, especially if you're a parent. You should have enough respect for yourself to go and look into that and see if what you're saying is true, or if possibly you have been conned and programmed to repeat the ideological talking points of a belief system that is using you to harm children. Okay, so this was 2012, after Dr. Levine left and said they've become fully ideological and political, they're not scientific anymore. Lo and behold, they put out a new Standards of Care, and they say that puberty blockers are a fully reversible pause button for adolescents. Not true. Despite the fact that the experiment was still in its earliest stages and no such conclusion could be drawn. Also, while on the one hand, SOC7 encouraged caution in psychotherapy that affirms the transgender identity, on the other hand, the guidance endorsed the, quote, informed consent model of care, which omits the need for psychotherapy. That's where they got rid of, you have to have a year of therapy and try to figure out if there's underlying issues or if you have comorbidities or other mental health problems that might describe, some of these symptoms. They got rid of that. No year of therapy needed. I just feel it. I'm a child and I feel it. Give me puberty blockers, give me hormones. I'll sign a consent form at 9 years old, not knowing what I'm doing. not knowing if I'm ever gonna wanna have kids, not knowing what sterilization means, not knowing what it means to have these body parts removed. We've seen a lot of these children, they're children. Some of them actually believe that they're changing their biological sex. These are kids. Has it been that long ago for you, being a child, that you don't remember some of the fantastical things you thought? It's the responsibility of the adults in your life, the people who are supposed to be protecting you, your parents, your teachers, the doctors, to prevent you from believing any of these fantastical things, to explain reality to you, to allow space for imagination and play and joy, but to help you ground yourself in reality. That's the job of the adults who are supposed to be protecting you, raising you. The adults in this society, this is happening, completely failed. We've failed an entire generation of kids that we're doing this to. So they started saying here, yeah, 9-year-olds, they don't need therapy. We don't need to figure out there might be underlying issues going on, peer pressure, sexual abuse, other mental health disorders, autism. We don't need to figure out what these other things are. They just need to sign a consent form that says they acknowledge that they might become sterile, that they acknowledge the repercussions of this treatment. A 9-year-old. So they endorse the informed consent model of care, which omits the need for psychotherapy and enables healthcare professionals to provide hormones on demand. This came 2 years after WPATH had issued a statement calling for the psychopathologization, that word, psychopathologization, I'm not gonna be able to do it, of gender variance worldwide, which framed being transgender as a normal, healthy variation of human existence. This is crazy. And this is what they've been teaching kids. So gender dysphoria was listed in the DSM as it's a mental disorder. We know it's a mental disorder. It is not normal to believe that you were born in the so-called wrong body. You're born into the body you're born into. There's no wrong body. It's not normal to feel that extreme discomfort or dysphoria in your body where you hate your biological sex. That's not normal. That's abnormal. We used to treat it as a mental health disorder, something that hopefully you could help to cure, to resolve in a person. They, social justice ideology woke, using WPATH, started pushing this idea here that feeling that way is normal, that it's a healthy variation of human existence. That's not true. That is a lie. Less than 1% of people have struggled with gender dysphoria before they started pushing this ideology onto children in schools and kindergartens, through these children's books aimed at indoctrinating the most vulnerable among us, children, and introducing this idea to them as if this is a normal thing that they need to figure out. Less than 1% of children had experienced gender dysphoria, and now suddenly look at the numbers skyrocket. Is it any wonder? You're telling them they need to figure out, are you this super special thing that we're gonna put on a pedestal and celebrate or not? You need to figure out if you're trans or cis. That's a normal thing to figure out. It's not. And by the way, if you pick one of these things, we're gonna celebrate you, and we're gonna put you on a pedestal, and we're gonna cut your genitalia off, and we're gonna sterilize you. We're gonna sacrifice you to this belief system and throw a party for you. And if you die from it, like Yarden did, if you develop liver cancer, like the doctors have acknowledged some of the girls have, if you regret it, like many of the detransitioners who are brave enough to come out and speak against this, many of whom are suing the doctors now, if you regret it and you speak out, we will shame you, ignore you, invalidate you, treat you as an apostate, a heretic, refuse medical care, tell you there's nothing we can do for you. That's what this ideology is doing to these kids. The Standards of Care 7 followed on from this, suggesting that any medical health issue in a person identifying as transgender is due to, quote, minority stress. I'm sorry. I have to laugh at they coin new terms all the time, this cult. Any mental health that they might be having it's called minority stress. Ask your doctor, do you have minority stress? A result of prejudice and discrimination in society. Then, a year after the publication of the Standards of Care 7, in line with WPATH, the American Psychiatric Association, the APA, released the 5th edition of the DSM, which we mentioned, the DSM-5, in which gender identity disorder was renamed. Remember when this happened? Gender identity disorder was renamed dysphoria. This redefinition shifted the focus of diagnosis from the identity itself to the distress and difficulty in social functioning arising from the incongruity between the mind and body. In the decade that passed between the publication of SOC 7 and SOC 8 in 2022, WPATH veered into new terrain. Just 2 days after the Standards of Care 8 was published in September of 2022, the group hastily removed almost all lower age requirements from the document in a bid to avoid malpractice lawsuits. The Standard of Care 8 also contains a chapter on non-binary medical interventions, which include recommendations on nullification procedures to create a smooth, sexless appearance for people who identify as neither male nor female, and penis-preserving vaginoplasties for those patients who desire both sets of genitals. This is what we talked about in the intro last week. They are doing medical experiments on children. This is on par with the medical experiments that were being performed in Nazi Germany. I don't say that hysterically, hyperbolically. I say that factually. They are trying to create something that does not exist in nature. These experiments the results are freakish Frankenstein looking. This is what they're doing for their so-called non-binary kids. Of note, an earlier draft of Standards of Care 8 had contained a chapter on ethics, but this was cut from the final version. However, it was the inclusion of a whole chapter on eunuch as a valid gender identity, eligible for hormonal and surgical castration. Eunuch. This is WPATH. This is who is guiding healthcare policy for so-called trans kids in the US and beyond. You may be a eunuch. Have you asked your doctor? Eunuch as a valid gender identity, eligible for hormonal and surgical castration, that it sent shockwaves through the medical profession and provided the catalyst for the Beyond WPATH declaration, now signed by more than 2,000 concerned individuals, many of whom are clinicians working with gender diverse young people. By the way, again, if you're on the left and you're watching this, and I'm pretty sure you have not followed the news and the facts, in addition to several progressive countries in Europe now banning these procedures and these medications and for children under the age of 18. In addition to that, there have been many whistleblowers who've come forward. We've covered that on this channel. You may not be aware. You probably aren't aware. There are many whistleblowers who've come forward, many of them gay themselves. One she's married to a trans man, so a biological woman who presents as a man. She's married to a trans man herself. Whistleblowers who spent their career working in so-called gender affirming care for kids, who've come forward and said, this is wrong. Here's what's happening. You should look into these stories. You should look into these whistleblowers. You should look into these clinicians who are signing this and saying this is wrong what we're doing to kids. This is not ethical medicine. This is not scientific. It's not supported by research. It's experimental. And children are not capable of giving consent. Learn the very basic facts of the situation we're dealing with. If you want to have an opinion and comment on it, familiarize yourself with the information. How can you expect us to be the only ones who know these things and still and then expect us to have conversations with you when you won't familiarize yourself with what's going on? It may not change your opinion. You seem to think it won't. So read about it. The declaration states that WPATH has discredited itself with its standard of care 8 and can no longer be viewed as a trustworthy source of clinical guidance in the field of gender medicine. At Environmental Progress, we echo this call, and we go one step further, calling for the reputable medical organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Psychiatric Association, and the American Medical Association to cut ties with WPATH, with this organization, and to abandon its guidelines in favor of ethical, evidence-based medicine. The author of this report contacted each member who appears in the files and leaked panel discussion requesting comment. However, despite these efforts, only one member of WPATH responded, and that response contained legal threats. Also, a source or sources shared an internal email showing WPATH advising against replying and informing the recipients that WPATH was seeking legal counsel. Okay, I'm going to stop here. We just got through page 9. We're going to future episodes, we're going to do a better job of summarizing. I wanted to read, since the history is so brief, just a couple pages. It felt like, let's read the whole history together. And let's look into Dr. John Money. He's the one I think you should be most familiar with in conversations when you try to talk about this with friends and family. And maybe you're able to give them some information. Maybe they're open-minded enough to listen. I encourage you to try and speak with kindness. This is a subject that necessarily produces righteous anger because these are children's lives at stake. And so that's understandable. I'm struggling with the righteous anger myself. But if you want people to listen to you, you have to try and have these conversations in a calm manner and rein in your tone a little. I'm speaking from experience, chastising myself. So, oh, thank you for the super chats. Keto and Crime, my friend Tracy's here. Keto and Crime for $10 says gender is a binary. Gender confirmation is a construct, i.e. tomboys, feminine men. Sex is non-negotiable, and so is gender. I would like to get rid of the term altogether. Same. Girl, same. I don't use gender anymore, except when I'm having to describe something they believe in and having to talk about it and address it. But in terms of, I had adopted this way of thinking, obviously, as part of my time in the woke cult, my 20 years in the cult, where I viewed sex and gender as two discrete things, two separate things. And I know I'm no longer playing that game. It took me a while to undo that one. There's a lot of these programmed beliefs that I picked up in the cult that it's taken me a while to get rid of, some longer than others. And that one I held on to for quite a while. I no longer believe it. It's absolute bullshit. There's no such thing as gender identity. I like what Billboard Chris says about it. I'm going to get the wording. I'm not going to get it exactly right, but it's similar to something I've said as well, which is there's there's biological sex and gender, which are the same thing. Okay. And then there's personality. Some people pretend they have a special secret super gender identity because they don't have a personality. They mistake it for personality or character, right? I think Billboard Chris says there are infinite personalities, right? Infinite personalities. There's also fashion. And you can play with gender and gender norms all you want. And you can, be a man who likes to dress more feminine or a woman who likes to dress more masculine. And, the sky's the limit. But that does not make you the opposite sex, and it does not mean that you have some special gender, like, I've got this separate thing and it's this I'm this gender, but this sex. No, you're not. You are a man who likes to dress like a woman. Okay, fine. Big whoop. Call the presses. Alert them. Who cares? And these kids today that are like, They have like 92 different gender identities to choose from. It's it's crazy. We're spreading mental illness to children. You should look through these well, I'm aerosexual and I'm this identity and and my fur skin and my this and my sorry. Get a personality. How about that? Keto and crime for $5. Thank you again, Tracy. She says gender ideology is based on the studies of pedos. Yeah, they are pedos, John Money and Kenzie. Well, we're going to look a little bit more into John Money today. Just let me check out the chat, see if there's anything else. Zarin says, blood does boil on this topic really, really easily. It does. I'm telling you, yes, from experience and trying to have these conversations. And I think they're best had in person, as a lot of difficult conversations, because it's easier to see each other's face and to read social cues and to understand tone. And it's also easier to not let yourself get carried away by anger or to be rude. I think it's easier to pop off online, so be very careful when you try to have these conversations. That's what I do anyway. I'm just telling you my advice for myself, which is to try and restrain that anger and to try and be calm and kind. And I don't always succeed. And sometimes I'm a little more brusque than I need to be. And I'm learning through experience, through trying to have these conversations. So Carol B, how have we raised kids with no personal identity? I'm just going to do a plug here for my pastor, Bradley Helgerson at the Church on the Square in Georgetown, Texas. They've got a YouTube channel here, Church on the Square. All of his sermons go up there. They're brilliant. He's talked about this a lot. He talked about it a little bit yesterday in our sermon, which is that it's a fairly modern way of looking at the identity, which is that we somehow have this special, unique identity that we need to turn inward and look and pull out of ourselves. And for a lot of kids, see, he was saying in the old days, your identity is shaped by community. It is shaped by belonging. Not to use a woke word, but I'm using the real meaning of that word. It's shaped by belonging. Your identity is shaped by your family, the community you belong to, the faith you belong to, your family. Think about trying to describe who you are. And he was saying this yesterday, and not mentioning some kind of relationship to someone. Like I am a mother, or I'm a father, or I'm a daughter, or if I'm a child of God. There's relationships involved, and we've kind of gotten rid of that way of thinking, and now identity has become this really narcissistic sort of inward. Like, who am I as a special creature? And let me find that and broadcast that to the world, this sort of navel gazing identity. And a lot of young people, what they're pulling out of there is what woke is giving them. It's a whole list of their special oppressed categories, their identities, within this belief system that gives them cultural currency, social currency. It's better to be in one of these so-called marginalized groups. And so they're looking for as many marginalizations as they can. And so they're pulling all of these out. If they've got a lot of things on the oppressor boxes, like if they're, "Ooh, I'm white. Oh, I'm a male." That it's very attractive, I would say. You're setting up incentives for them to then find ways in which they're marginalized in this whole playground of the queer theory part of social justice. Oh, I'm an amosexual or an aerosexual, and I'm this kind of oppressed. One of these is I've done episodes on this before. One of these, I'm forgetting the name of it, but one of it's a so-called new sexuality. You can be an oppressed sexuality. My friend Mike Carlo and I've made fun of this one before. It's the one where they say, I can't remember what it's called, but it means my sexuality is that I'm only sexually attracted to people that I'm emotionally attracted to as well, or I'm only emotionally attracted to people I'm sexually. It's just something stupid. It's like, that's not a sexuality. That's not a separate, like, sexual that's my sexual orientation. But think about it. We made fun of it because we've seen people online come out as this thing and be like, I'm coming out as this oppressed minority, and it's really hard to live as an aerosexual, and it gives them this credit, and that's part of their unique identity now. Their person, what they're mistaking for a personality, that's not your identity. Sorry, it's kind of silly. Pokemon sexual. Girl, Davina, I guarantee, put that word into Google right now. I guarantee you some of these crazy wokies have come up with some Pokemon sexual identity. I'm not kidding. That's the state we're at. There's almost no room for satire anymore because you look it up, you're like, oh, I'm gonna make a joke about this. Then you find out they did this. They did this in seriousness. They did it in seriousness. Okay. I'm gonna bring up a book. We're gonna look at some stuff about John Money, but I'm gonna bring up this book real quick. So this book is one of the books that's referenced in our recent book club selection, Critical Dilemma by Neil Shenvi and Pat Sawyer. And they have a whole chapter on queer theory. They do a great job of breaking down what I call social justice into the different identity group doors that you can enter through. So they have one on, like, race, they have one on queer theory. Here's the thing, this book, and if you want to really get into and read source material, you can go get this book. This is Queer Theory by Anne Marie Jagos. Now, she's not the only queer theorist, the only academic to write about this. I just wanted to show you one quote because you may not be familiar with this, but the academics, the queer theorists, I'm not talking about the people out here in your everyday life who are speaking this ideology after having it filtered down from academia to education through pop culture, through TikTok, and now they've got it here on the street level. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about the academics, the one who the architects of this belief system, the ones who are coining the terms, coming up with the ideology, writing the so-called theory. They believe not only that biological sex is just a social construct, okay? And that gender is a social construct, that it's a separate thing and it's a social construct. They also believe that age is a social construct that must be destroyed. This is very common among the queer theorists. They believe that another one of these categories of identity is age, and it is ageist not to treat children the same as adults. They believe this. They argue this. They argue that children are an oppressed minority because we don't treat them as full humans. Full humans meaning we don't treat them like adults. I know that some of you are smart enough, you're already realizing where this is going. One obvious place this is going, which is what this whole topic is about, is they believe that children are the same as adults, that children have the capability of deciding if they want to change their sex or not, to have these surgeries done when they're 9, or to go on puberty blockers, which are going to render them unable to achieve orgasm for life. They think kids, they argue, I don't know if they really believe this or if they just have evil desires, but they argue that kids are capable of understanding this and consenting to this, that they're full adults. I'm going to show you something that just came out today, arguing this today, that they're full adults, and if you don't allow them to change their sex through these medicines and these surgeries, that you're not treating them as full humans and that you are being bigoted to kids. Okay, now those of you who are smart enough to know where this is going. They also believe that children are capable of consenting to sex. They argue on behalf of pedophilia. They argue that if you don't allow children to quote unquote consent to sex with adults, that you're being a bigot towards them. This is not some crazy right-wing talking point. This is true. You can go and read the book Queer Theory. You can read the original sources where they argue this. It sounds crazy. You know why? Because it hasn't filtered. That part hasn't filtered all the way down yet to TikTok. That part is still in the education space, the academia space. It's being filtered currently down into the education space from academia. You know, they're going to start teaching this because people are learning this. Teachers are learning this. Activists are learning this. It's going to filter down into social media and into pop culture eventually. That's where it is going. Yes, they are. Now, if you tell a person who's woke, like on, I guess, could we call it street woke? If you, just someone who, they're not an academic, they don't know, they've never read any of the source material. They don't know where this ideology they're speaking comes from. They don't know where the words come from. They don't know where white privilege was coined or white fragility or intersectionality. They don't know any of it. They've never read any of it, but it's filtered down to pop culture. And that's where they picked it up on Tumblr or social media or TikTok or in their school when they were a kid. If you say to one of these street woke people, right, this ideology supports sexual abuse of kids, pedophilia, it does. They will oh, that's crazy. No, I don't. That's crazy. We don't do that. That's a right-wing talking point because, once again, they've never read any of the architects of the ideas that they've been programmed with. They don't know where any of this comes from. They've never read it. Here, I'm going to read an excerpt of Queer Theory to you. We've read some of this stuff before. I'm just going to give you another content warning. Sorry. Okay. This is from the book Queer Theory by Anne-Marie Jagos. Quote, variously referred to as intergenerational sex. Makes it sound so academic and smart, right? Intergenerational sex, child abuse, man-boy love, and pedophilia. Even the semantic continuum of terms used to describe the concept evokes a variety of positions in a debate structured overwhelmingly by such issues as consent, power, and the legal definition of childhood. The issue of intergenerational sex continues to be debated vigorously in many gay and lesbian communities. The protection of children is deemed by some to be ethically crucial to the development of gay identity, but it's dismissed by others as erotic hysteria. What is the status of different and arbitrary age of consent laws? Do children have a sexuality and a right to sexual agency? What is age? Unlike, say, race or class, understood as a sexualized power differential protected by law, is it possible to eroticize children in an ethical way? The book says this. The book asks this question. These are monsters. This ideology is monstrous. Is it possible to eroticize children in an ethical way? These are questions commonly raised, commonly in this field. Yes, this is from the horse's own mouth, commonly raised in queer theory. And by no means yet resolved. That's what the book says. So they're still thinking on it. We're still asking till we get the answer we want. Till society gives us the answer we want, which is that we can predate on children. I'm going to stop reading there. I've read worse things than that even. We read one on this channel before. I'm surprised that video didn't get taken down. This will probably get taken down. You know what's crazy is they push this ideology and they're trying to push it on all of society and on kids. But if you actually read their own words about it, you can get banned if you're doing so in a critical way because I'm just talking about this, So Lindsay has the best answer for this. Is there a way to eroticize children in an ethical way? No, you flippin' idiot. I bring this up because this is where the ideology is going. It's where it's gonna try to go next. I saw someone joking on Twitter yesterday. They said, "Trans is old and boring now. What's next?" And I was like, "Well, I hate to tell you where they're taking this next is child sexual abuse, normalizing it as look, they're gonna have all the same Orwellian phrases they come up with for mutilating and sterilizing kids. Oh, it's gender affirming care, right? They're gonna do the same thing. They're gonna call it like intergenerational sex. They've already come up with a new word for pedophiles. And what is it? Minor attracted person. You wouldn't want to cause harm to a minor attract. You wouldn't want to cause demonization of minor attracted people, would you? Sadicus, man, yes, we are just cattle to sociopaths. Yes, we are. Andrew Joyner for $5. Thank you, Andrew. It's not dollars, sorry, it's lira. I'm kidding. I'm kidding, new people. I know it's pounds. I have to always say that now because otherwise I get angry, or not angry, but incredulous comments. Okay. Andrew says, I think I mentioned before, but I recommend anyone to read Time to Think by Hannah Barnes about the Tavistock Clinic in the UK. I appreciate you mentioning it again. I'm going to put it on my list. Thank you for that suggestion. Okay. Since we're talking about where this is going and we're talking about child sexual abuse and how it relates to trans and kids, to gender ideology, which is the ideological basis for both. We're going to look at a little bit more on David Reimer. Here, I'm pulling up a Daily Mail article, and I don't care about you people who say, oh, the Daily Mail. A lot of liberals do that, or people who think they're liberal. Leftists do that about the Daily Mail. I actually find that they usually have the most photos in their articles, and they go and collect information from a variety of other publications. So they usually have the most information. And I don't, yeah, whatever you think of it. I know they're sensationalist, but we're going to read from the Daily Mail. Okay. The spiritual father of the trans movement, Dr. John Money, his twisted experiment in the 1960s, and the tragic deaths of the twin boys whose lives were ruined. How his harrowing true story is a cautionary tale for our times, writes Tom Leonard. This was published in June of last year. There's a lot of stuff on this on John Money and David Reimer. If you look into it, if you want to go down that very sad rabbit hole. David Reimer, 38, used a shotgun to kill himself in a supermarket car park in 2004. David had been subjected to a cruel experiment by academic Dr. John Money for help. Then they have a number there if you're feeling despondent. On May 4th, 2004, David Reimer drove to a supermarket car park and, still sitting in the car, pulled out a shotgun and killed himself. At 38, he ended a life that had been so full of pain and anguish that some who knew him were only surprised that he had battled on for so long. I'm going to make this just a little larger. From when he was only a few months old until into his teenage years, David had been subjected to a perverse, cruel, and disastrously misguided experiment by a celebrated sex psychologist who was determined to show the world that he could transform a boy into a girl. The academic concerned, John Money, is often hailed as the spiritual father of today's trans movement. His research underpins the central claim we hear so often nowadays that while biological sex may be innate, gender identity, a term that Money helped to popularize. If you didn't know that, when you hear gender identity, Dr. Money. Next time you hear gender identity, ask the person, do you know who coined that term? Do you know about Dr. Money? Along with coining the term, he also coined the term sexual orientation and socially constructed. From this stems the great modern progressive dogma that sex is irrelevant and what truly matters is which gender a person feels they are. Again, if that were true, then they wouldn't place so much emphasis on surgically altering children who feel more effeminate or more masculine. They wouldn't place so much if it's truly fluid and if what's what's important is how you feel, then why are we doing these Frankenstein experiments on children? If an adult can do what they want, but for kids, why are we experimenting on them? Let them feel, let it be a boy who feels more feminine. Why do you have to sterilize him and prevent him from ever having, you know, sexual orgasm or reproducing or like, why do you have to do that to him? This is Mr. Money, the monster. However, trans rights warriors barely mention Money's name now, and no wonder, for despite his lasting influence on the movement, his research was built on a lie, and his twisted experiment destroyed the life not only of David Reimer, but of his twin brother, too. Brian Reimer, who, like David, said he was sexually abused as a youngster by Money, went on to take a fatal drug overdose that may have been intentional. The appalling story began in 1965 when the identical Reimer twins, Brian and Bruce. David Reimer was born Bruce Reimer. So that's why that it's a little confusing. The two brothers are Brian and Bruce. Bruce is later changed his name to David. Okay. The identical twin Reimer twins, Brian and Bruce, were born to a working class Canadian couple, Janet and Ron Reimer, in Winnipeg, Manitoba. The boys were perfectly healthy, but after 7 months, both were having trouble urinating. On medical advice, their parents took them to the hospital to be circumcised. The following morning, the doctors rang with horrifying news. Instead of a scalpel, an electric cauterizing pen had been used for the procedure, and in Bruce's case, David's case, the equipment had drastically malfunctioned. A surge in the current had entirely burnt off his penis, and surgeons would not be able to reconstruct it. Mr. and Mrs. Reimer, young parents from a religious background, were bluntly informed by a psychiatrist that their son would be, quote, unable to consummate marriage or to have normal heterosexual relations, and he would have to recognize that he is incomplete and physically defective. Naturally, they were distraught. But then, a year later, in spring of 1967, they saw John Money being interviewed on television. A native New Zealander, the trailblazing doctor, was then working at Baltimore's Johns Hopkins University, one of America's most celebrated medical schools, where he had established the first U.S. clinic that performed sex reassignment surgeries. Here's the two brothers, Brian and David. Janet and Ron watched in fascination as the charismatic and acclaimed researcher described his theory based on his work with intersex or hermaphrodite patients who had been born with both male and female sex characteristics. That he believed all babies are gender neutral. No matter its genitalia. Have you heard this? By the way, John Money's ideas, again, have filtered down to the street woke because have you heard these woke parents that are now raising babies? We're not going to call him he. We're going to call him they, and let they figure out when they're old enough what sex they are. You know, gender neutral babies. They believe to do otherwise is to impose gender on the child, to assign biological sex. All of this filters down from this pedophile, John Money. So he believed that all babies were gender neutral. No matter its genitalia, he claimed any baby could be streamed, thanks to hormone injections and surgery, into a gender chosen by others. The Reimers, desperate to ensure their mutilated son would have some chance of a normal life, saw a possible solution and they contacted the doctor. Yet they also provided an unwitting solution to his problem. Until then, he had been unable to conduct his experiments, or he had been able to conduct his experiments only on so-called intersex children. Where could he find a test case baby who would demonstrate that his radical theory applied to all children? No parent would have voluntarily submitted to raising their child as the opposite sex purely to prove Money's point. Of course, the Reimers were doubly attractive to the psychologist because Bruce's identical twin brother Brian represented what researchers call a perfect control group, against whom Money could compare Bruce's progress as a female. At the time, it was much easier to surgically construct a vagina than a penis, and Money was able to persuade the Reimers that Bruce should be raised as a female. There's a picture of them together. That's Brian and Bruce, aka David. But for the experiment to work, he said neither of the twins must ever be told the truth. Although initially reluctant, Janet and Ron were impressed by Money's intelligence and his persuasive powers, and eventually they agreed. Bruce, now renamed Brenda, was thus castrated when, quote, she was 22 months old. A rudimentary vulva was fashioned for her by doctors at Money's hospital. The sexologist prescribed that Brenda should start taking female hormones when she was 12. The Reimers did not appreciate until years later that the course Money so confidently outlined for Brenda had never been attempted on a developmentally normal, that is, non-intersex child. I looked up to him like a god, Janet, who was in her teens when she gave birth, later said of Money. I accepted whatever he said. She would regularly write the sexologist about Brenda's progress, and every year the twins would visit him and he would interrogate them at length. In 1972, when the children were 7, Money published a book called Man and Woman, Boy and Girl about the case, although he gave the family pseudonyms. The experiment, he announced, had been a total success. Oh, this is the other thing about him, is he loved to brag about what a success his experiment was when it was a failure the entire way. But the press, for the longest time, would tout it as a success. Now they've changed their tune, finally. But they used to be like, yeah, it's totally successful. In part, they changed their tune because of the tragic ending for these two brothers and what they had to say, what David had to say before he ended his life. The experiment he announced had been a total success. The girl happily wore dresses and played with dolls while her brother loved cars, soldiers, and climbing trees. Money had finally won the international acclaim he had so long craved. Around the world, the idea of sex reassignment surgery for children suddenly became more acceptable. But Money always knew that the rosy picture he had painted was far from accurate. As Brenda, Reimer would later admit in interviews, both she and her brother knew early on that something was not right. Far from enjoying wearing them, she tore off the lacy dresses her mother made her wear and showed no interest in makeup. Aged 4, she said she wanted to try out her father's razor. Age 6, she announced that she wanted to be a garbage collector. She hated playing with dolls and always chose her brother's toys instead. Her mother reassured her that she was just a tomboy. At school, Brenda never fit in, rejected by both the girls she didn't want to play with and the boys that she desperately wanted to join. She was bullied mercilessly, and even the teachers were uncomfortable around her. She was very rebellious. She was very masculine, and I could not persuade her to do anything feminine, said her mother, Janet, years later. Brenda had almost no friends growing up. Everybody ridiculed her and called her cave woman. She was a very lonely, lonely girl. What Brenda and her brother Brian particularly loathed were their annual trips to see Money for interviews conducted without their parents present. From the age of 6, Dr. John Money would show these two boys naked pictures of men and women, boys and girls, and naked pictures of adults having sex. Screaming at them in fury until they obeyed, he would force them to strip off their clothes and examine each other's genitals. Most twisted of all, he often asked them to, quote, play at thrusting movements and copulation, end quote, with the prepubescent siblings forced to pretend to have sex in various positions. These encounters would be photographed, and sometimes Money would summon his academic colleagues to watch as he sexually abused these kids. Money was no impartial researcher. Having rebelled against his own repressive religious upbringing, he was a bisexual who championed nudity, open marriage, group sex, and hardcore pornography. Shocker. Shocker, right? He also had deeply unsettling views on children and sex. In 1980, he was accused of endorsing pedophilia and incest after he told Time magazine, quote, a childhood sexual experience such as being the partner of a relative or an older person need not necessarily affect the child adversely. Do you hear this monster? The boldness of this monster to say that out loud, to admit that he thinks that to Time magazine. Must have felt he was very safe to share that opinion, given all of the acclaim that society had imparted on him. Famous doctor at Johns Hopkins, right? Successfully sex changed a child. Felt very comfortable saying that out loud to Time magazine. He reportedly told a Dutch academic journal that he did not see any problem with a sexual relationship between a boy aged 10 or 12 who's intensely attracted toward a man in his 20s or 30s. Brenda, aka David Reimer, told the BBC in 2000, quote, I thought he was perverted. I thought he was a sick man. As Brenda grew older, she increasingly felt herself to be male. She adamantly refused to have more extensive surgery to construct a new vagina, a procedure that Money regarded as essential to cementing his patient's psychological sex change. On the last occasion that Brenda was dragged to see Money in her early teens, she ran to the roof of the building to get away from him. Again, this is David we're talking about. Although her parents and doctors had persuaded her to start taking the hormone, I hate using her. Although his parents and doctors had persuaded him to start taking the hormone estrogen when he was 12, leading to him developing breasts, even as his voice became deeper, he threatened to commit suicide if they ever took him back to see Money. By now, both girls and boys at school were refusing to let David use their bathrooms, forcing him to relieve himself in a back alley. The Reimer family and other doctors who had supported Money's plan could see that David's talk of suicide was serious, and they backed off. In 1979, when he was 14, he stopped living as a girl. The following year, the twins' father took David. They're still calling him Brenda. You just said he stopped living as a girl. The twins' father took David out for an ice cream and dropped the bombshell that he had been born a boy named Bruce and had suffered a botched circumcision and been raised as a girl on the advice of John Money. Brenda had always been a fiction. Within months, Brenda changed his name to David. He started taking male hormones and had his breasts surgically removed. He finally made a close friend, one of his brother's pals, Harold Normand. This week, Mr. Norman told the Mail that he and David had shared a passion for tinkering with cars. Mr. Norman revealed that when asked, the Reimers would gloss over why Brenda had suddenly disappeared aged 14 and David had appeared, unconvincingly claiming that she had actually been a cousin who had died in a car accident while David was a long-lost brother. Is that crazy? They were pretending like he was just a different person. Wow. Like, what, I guess, how would you explain it? I guess they didn't want to explain it. Yet while the teenage David was far happier as a male, Mr. Norman said he soon had to confront the limitations of his situation. Although he underwent painful surgery to try and create a penis, it was hardly a proper substitute. David tried to have girlfriends, said Mr. Norman, but it didn't work out. He told one of them he had had an accident with his genitalia, and suddenly the whole school knew and was laughing at him. Days later, after he had overdosed on antidepressants, his parents momentarily wondered whether it might not be kinder to let him die. As David grew older, he desperately wanted to have children, but having been castrated as an infant on Dr. Money's advice, he was physically unable to. Then his brother's wife introduced him to a friend, Jane Fontaine, who already had 3 children but no partner. David and Jane hit it off immediately, and they married in 1990. Quote, "I would have to say he was a great father and, a wonderful husband, and he was very romantic," said Jane, who has since died. It took David years to discover all the lies that money had told the scientific world about him, falsely presenting him as a successful case, when in fact his life had been ruined by the doctor. David said he wanted to physically attack Dr. Money if they ever met again. In 1997, to spare other children similar treatment, he and his brother Brian revealed the truth about Dr. Money's reprehensible behavior to one of the doctor's bitter academic opponents, Milton Diamond, who had become suspicious about Dr. Money's account. As David headed into his 30s, a series of personal setbacks, including losing his job, being defrauded of his savings, and separating from his wife, plunged him into depression. His relationship with brother Brian had always been difficult, but deteriorated after they discovered they were really brothers, not a brother and sister. Brian had also been deeply upset by the deception, and he died from a drug overdose in 2002. Mr. Norman told the Mail that David's parents, both of whom have also since died, held a small funeral and buried Brian in a secret place because they were worried about disruption from callous local people who had never understood David's appalling situation and thought he was better off dead. 2 years later, David shot himself. His parents blamed money for traumatizing their child and turning him suicidal. But they were also guilt-ridden, and Mrs. Reimer attempted suicide while her husband became an alcoholic. This whole family destroyed by this psychopath, John Money. David never blamed his parents, said Mr. Norman, but nor did he ever forgive the 2 experts who had ruined his life, the doctor, who originally botched the circumcision, and Money, who died in 2006. The scars he had from these 2 mentally affected him. He would get depressed about it, he recalled. In 2004, the BBC Horizon program called this case a cautionary tale about what can happen when science pursues a beautiful theory with scant regard for the human cost. Can you imagine the BBC saying that today? That was 2004. Can you imagine them saying today, this is a cautionary tale about what can happen when science pursues theory with scant regard for human cost? Because that's what's happening with trans and kids today. Pursuing theory, doing medical experimentation without regard for the human cost. It's a little background on John Money. Yeah, Davina says, yeah, today the BBC is all for this insanity. Yeah, they are. I heard something from a friend who is a filmmaker. I'm trying to remember which director it was. I think it was Peter Jackson. So what I heard is that the story of Dr. Money, John Money, and David Reimer, the rights to it were optioned by Peter Jackson, and that he was going to be doing this story. Yes, here it is. It's true. Okay. Now, this is a while back. Peter Jackson from Lord of the Rings. I think he's a great director. At one point, he had optioned the rights to tell this story, but this was before the queer theory, the transing kids part of woke had exploded into popularity. And so Here, let me just put this article on the screen. This is from New Zealand Herald, I think. Yeah. So this is just an article from a while back about Steven Spielberg and Peter Jackson, but it mentions it here. Jackson has also considered making a film called As Nature Made Him, the story of Canadian man David Reimer. So it's based on a book, making a film of As Nature Made Him, the story of Canadian man David Reimer, who was raised a female after a botched circumcision when he was aged just 7 months. It has a New Zealand connection in the involvement of noted New Zealand psychologist, sexologist Dr. John Money. He recommended gender reassignment surgery to Reimer's parents, who renamed him Brenda and raised him as a girl. At 15, Reimer transitioned to living as a male. He died at the age of 38 in 2005. They don't mention how he died. They don't mention any of the child sexual abuse or anything. Money spent most of his professional career in the United States, though was a supporter of the arts and literature in his home country and a friend of author Janet Frame. Look at this article. It's just, if you read this, you would know nothing about this monster, right? How crazy is that? But I bring this up only because my friend had heard that, Peter Jackson had optioned this story and was going to tell this story. And then at some point that was like 2014 is when he was considering making this movie. He let his option go. He gave up the right to make the movie. And my friend and I were just speculating possibly that it was because transing kids, so after 2014 at some, became very popular and mainstream, that he wouldn't want to touch this, I guess. He wouldn't want to touch it, face the criticism of criticizing the father of transing kids. They would attack him if he made this movie. So as far as I know, if anyone can find out differently, the option for that book on the story of David Reimer is still up for grabs. I'm not sure. I can't remember what my friend said, but somebody needs to make this movie. Maggie Ellis, thank you for the super chat. Oh, I remember you. When people have the same avatar photo, it helps my memory. So I remember you in your beautiful wedding picture with the kilt, with your husband with the kilt. Okay, Maggie Ellis, thank you for the super chat. Says nature versus nurture. I think we're coming back around to nature's heavy hand. This is significant. P.S. Hey there, Chicka. Hello. Yeah, I think it's all a combination. When you see anything that's out of the norm, so without moral judgment, take moral judgment out of it. There's nothing bad about saying, hey, gender dysphoria is not normal. It's not normal. There's no moral judgment there. It's an abnormality. Being born with one of these genetic disorders that get lumped into intersex, those are also not normal. There's no moral judgment there. You're born with an abnormality. When you look at some of the psychological ones or some of the things that are abnormal, I think it's like almost everything, it's this weird mix of nature and nurture. A lot of these theorists, they tend to lean heavy-handed into one or the other, and it's like, I don't know, it's always seemed common sense to me that it's a little of both. Oh, I see my husband is in the chat. I feel like the quote from the BBC in your insight needs to be pinned somehow, or maybe clip that. That's very important to highlight. Thank you. Thank you for the suggestion. My dear husband, he also did. I'm Legolas from Lord of the Rings. Do you guys remember that from the TV show Extras? we love that episode. Dion, wow, that's very tragic. If that movie had been made, it might have given some pause to the madness, right? I wish he had made that movie. ADL. Hey, ADL says, what's amazing is that in 2000, Oprah discussed this topic and several TV shows addressed it. Amazing how fast people forget things. Yeah. Also amazing how fast culture can change, right? It seemingly, to some people, I know it seems like it changed overnight on this issue, and all of a sudden society's like, "Sure, cut the genitals off kids, sterilize them. It's for their own good," right? Like, how did that happen overnight? But you have all this decades of slow progress, starting with, the academics who are writing this theory and seeding it into education and seeding it into pop culture, and it trickles down to TikTok woke, to street woke, right? It takes a long time. But once it reaches that level of public consciousness, then it seems like it takes off overnight. But, it's growing for decades. Tracy, Keto and Crime says, to make that movie, either the Daily Wire or someone like them, someone with some FU money would have to do it. You know who should get into funding the arts? Elon Musk. Elon freaking Musk, we know you have a lot of money to play with and to throw around. Wouldn't it be great if people started asking Elon, like, "Hey, will you fund some original productions? Like, create a studio, do something." He's got some FU money to play with, and he seems to like triggering people. Um, Dion, I love how Dr. Phil has decided to come out about all this woke. Dr. Phil, I think he was let out of his contract or something, which I think people have speculated that he was under some kind of network contract that would not allow him to speak freely, because all of a sudden something has changed with that man. He is reality based. So he is speaking truth. He's going on podcasts. He's speaking truth. He's speaking against this mutilation, sterilization of children. I did not have that on my 2024 bingo card, but God bless you, Dr. Phil. I think you're doing I think you're doing kids a great service. I hope you keep speaking. You have a lot of credibility among certain demographics. A lot of women watch his show or respect what he has to say, and women happen to be the demographic that has been targeted the most by this ideology, and who are the most susceptible to it and are pushing it on children. And so I hope he has an effect with women. If you haven't listened to him, go listen to some of his interviews. You'll be pleasantly surprised. His recent ones. Ian so far says Elon's the $1 billion troll. So my voice is a little sore now from reading. That was a lot of stuff to read today. So I'm gonna take off. I think I'm gonna wrap it up. Plus, it's been about 2 hours. Wow. Um, Again, I'm gonna be streaming every day at 1 this week. We're gonna be just working through the WPATH files and highlighting important parts of it. If you like this video, please hit like. Please consider leaving a comment below. That helps the video algorithm. It helps it to be seen by more people. If you wanna support the channel, you can become a member at YouTube. You can leave a super chat, or we also simulcast on Rumble. You can leave a super chat there. I'm gonna read those. I forgot to read them last time. There was one. Hold on. But you can do that, or you can support it. Subscribe to our locals or Patreon or Substack. There's so many different ways to support my content. I hate that word, but content to support my channel and my writing if you want to. And if you like this episode, if you if you think that it might help someone on the left, someone that understand this better, consider sending it to them. Or maybe the first one. I'm trying really hard lately to, before I do these live shows, to keep in mind people on the left who I want to be able to hear this. So I'm trying to keep it helps for me to keep specific people in mind sometimes, and think, how would I talk to them if I was sitting down and talking to them in person and wanting them to hear me? And so I'm trying to do that. I hope that it's helpful. I really hope people get past these psychological blocks that are preventing them from looking at the WPATH files. I hope they trust themselves enough as adults to be able to read it and to parse opinion from fact, and then form their own informed, responsible opinions. Whatever those opinions may be, at least they'll be informed, right? I hope that happens. Thanks, Robert. Here's my link tree if you want to find all the links. Therese. Hey, Therese. Tough but necessary topic, Keri. See you later. See you later. Oh, hey, so I've got something fun. So I think I'm gonna. I know I keep saying we're gonna have merch this year. It's gonna happen. My husband and I are gonna be sitting down working on. I've got an artist who's helping. We're gonna be putting out merch soon. We do have some T-shirts and stuff on the YouTube below. It's just the old designs that I've had forever. You can look through those. Maybe you've never seen them, but we have some new things we're working on. But I want to do more. I'm having fun doing hodgepodge lately, and I'm gonna put together a few more pieces, and then I'm gonna sell them on Etsy. And if you want to support the channel that way, I mean, actually, I think I'll probably end up selling them for the cost of the materials and post. So never mind. This is going to be a negative endeavor for me. However, it just makes me happy to make them. And if you would like to buy one, I'm going to be putting some up soon. I know it seems kind of incongruent. Keri does a show about social justice ideology and woke, and then she's selling these hodgepodge things on Etsy. Yes, I am, because this is what I enjoy doing in my free time. And your whole world can't be just talking about the things you oppose, which are very important, this evil ideology, to talk about it. But this is lately what I'm getting a lot of relaxation and enjoyment from. And so this is one that I made. And that one is it's a clock face and then a lot of jewelry. And I'm just learning, I'm having fun learning and experimenting. So I love that one. So I'm keeping that one because that was the first one that I was proud of. And the next one, and I'll post them. I'll post a link if you're into that sort of thing and you would like an original deprogrammed piece of hodgepodge art. Let me know. And yeah, that's it. Keri, you need to have some palate cleanser closer to topics. Oh, I'm talking about the hodgepodge. Isn't that a palate cleanser? I think so. Next book for book club is what? Oh, that's right, Cheeky Mare. Thank you. I think I already picked it. There's several that I want to read, but I read and I will reread the new book by James Lindsay and Logan Lansing. And since it's out right now, I think we should do that one next. It's very worthwhile. It's specifically about the queer theory part of social justice ideology. It's focused on that. And hold on, I'll put the book on the screen. And because this topic, I mean, this is what we're talking about right now. This is the most important in terms of saving kids' lives, preventing kids from harm, protecting kids from harm. This is the book we should be reading. So, The Queering of the American Child by Logan Lansing with James Lindsay. I've read it. I can't recommend it enough. It's a deep dive into queer theory, and they do a great job of explaining how this moves from, like I was talking about, academia all the way down to what I was calling TikTok woke. But, all the different kinds of woke. There's the theorists, there's the activists, there's the pop culture people, there's the TikTok, So they do a great job of explaining that, how, like I was saying, a lot of people who speak woke have never read the theory behind it. They don't even understand what they've been programmed with, or that it is theory, or that, by the time it gets to street woke, it's like they just, what, like I did. You kind of just view it as like, this is progressivism. Although I did read some of the theory. Thank you, Cheeky Mare. That's where you can get a copy of the book, The Queering of the American Child. Michael Collier. Hello, sir. Thank you for the super chat for $19.99. He says, it's been a while since I caught a live stream. My wife and I love what you're doing. Now you need to convince Anthony to do more live streams discussing music and artists. Can I plug, Anthony, are you still listening? Can I plug what you're doing soon? Or would you rather I don't? I'm going to plug it, but vague. I won't say who in case you don't want me to talk about it yet. On my husband's channel, you can go and subscribe at anthonygarciamusic.com. He is going to be doing he's starting to do more live streams in his studio doing music. We did one together. It was a lot of fun where he was playing, but he's going to be interviewing some people about music. He's got an interview coming out with someone. It's a special guest who worked very closely with the Big Bopper and has all these amazing stories. He's already done the interview. He's cutting it now. It's incredible. You guys know the Big Bopper, right? Like Chantilly lace and a pretty face and a ponytail hanging down. You know what I'm talking about? That song? A wiggle and a walk and a giggle and a talk makes the world go round, round, round. I can't sing, but I love that song. And he did an interview all about the Big Bopper with this guy, and he's got pictures and personal info and stories that you may have never heard, and he's cutting it together. It's gonna be great. And so, yeah, so how coincidental and interesting, Michael, that you said he should do interviews about music because he's getting ready to do some. It's gonna be fun. Thanks for Nothing says, I think you need to be a certain age to know the Big Bopper. He was a big deal. Yeah, I was. I think I know him because probably because where I'm from, my small town, we had have 50s diner. It's still there. And it was like the one place everybody would go eat, and everything was decorated. The guy who ran the diner was a collector. And so there was like old Studebaker car and old radios and an old jukebox that only played 50s music. And, as a kid, I would just feed that thing quarters and listen to all the 50s music. And I know that stuff like I grew up then. And I love the Big Bopper. We were talking about, he sort of, if you go and watch some of his old videos, he kind of did some of the first music videos, and he was just such a big, larger than life character. I was saying to Anthony, if he were still around, if he hadn't died in that plane crash, he would probably be all over TikTok. He would probably be such a character. I bet he would have done movies, and comedy and stuff. I could see that. So, okay, guys. Hey, Brahma Bull. Hello, Brahma Bull. I mentioned at the beginning, I'll close with this. Wednesday night, 6:00 Central, we are doing another live That Christian panel. It's going to be myself, Brahma Bull, Michelle from Force of Light, Odin from OMB Reviews, and special guest Drunk 3PO. We're going to be talking about, reviewing, discussing the movie Ordinary Angels, which is currently in theaters. If you would like to see the movie before we discuss it live, you have time to go watch it. You have to go to the theater though, like in the old days. You have to go. It'll be fun. It's going to be fun because I haven't been in a while. So do that, and join us Wednesday night at 6:00 Central. We'll see you then. Okay. Have a good rest of your evening, and I'll see you guys tomorrow, same time, 1:00 Central. We're going to be going over more of the WPATH files. I'll see you then.